So tonight's program was advertised as the history of wired LAN competition. It's not going to be that. It is a history. No history is definitive. I wonder if it's the projector that took out the I in definitive. We won't even attempt that. This session is a small, opinionated slice out of the middle of the history of the topic. We certainly don't have time to cover everything, and I don't believe there's any such thing as covering everything anyway. Recommended reading on this topic is the rather good book, The Triumph of Ethernet, by Urs von Berg, who did it as a doctoral thesis while he was at Davis. And that focuses on some of the early proprietary competition and then competition with Token Ring. Our panel this evening, myself, as Alan told you, I was at Xerox PARC while Ethernet was being invented. I was working on laser printers and I got to be an early user. Then I went to Synoptics, which pioneered, for marketing purposes, Ethernet over twisted pair. And I started being active in 802.3 while I was at Xerox, and then became a full-time standards geek when I moved to Synoptics. And it was at that point I got to be chair of .3. Our panel members, Dan Pitt in the middle. When I first met Dan in my very early years in .3, he was working for IBM, and he was the IBM designated hitter in the designated observer. When 802 started, it was supposed to come up with one LAN, and that didn't last very long, and so it split into 3, and there was a mutual non-interference pact, as I understand it, and Dan was the non-interfering observer from IBM in .3. So we're looking to him for a great deal of our insight on Token Ring. Joe Skarupa, another long-term colleague, spent a little time with Wang and Interlan, and then Bitex and RHK in the Boston area, and went to 4 Systems, where he leveraged all of his East Coast LAN experience into trying to make ATM a going proposition. And Joe's always had a very broad view of things in the market, and he's now with Gartner, but he has blessedly been relieved of his LAN duties, and he now talks about storage.
Actually, no.
No?
Are you back? I never left. We've just added storage and compute to the work, but data center networking, high-speed networking.
Okay. And Tom Slykehouse, another of my old colleagues that I worked with at Synoptics. Tom came to Synoptics from previous career at AMD and Network Peripherals, where he was an FDDI bigot.
Yeah.
Advocate.
Thank you.
Proponent. And he did some product marketing there. And then when he arrived at Synoptics, he was the product manager for the first Synoptics 100 meg Ethernet switch. So that's the cast of criminals. Here's a rough timeline of wired LAN competition up until what I consider the coup de grace, which was the approval of 100 base T, which seemed to effectively cement the Ethernet dominance of the industry. And I would like to focus our talk this evening on the area that's in the box, which is sort of starts out in 1984-ish, when we've gotten Ethernet into the market, IBM's intentions into the market, PCs have arrived, and we really start to get into the heat of the battle. So, Dan, if you could lead us off with where and when IBM jumped into the fray and what its intentions were at that
Can you hold
point.
that thought for a second?
Sure.
Can you announce what the protocol is, your protocol for questions?
Oh, yes. My protocol for questions, since I'm an Ethernet bigot, is more or less the SMACD.
I think from the audience.
Yeah,
That's what he means.
That's what I'm talking about. So if you'll stick your hand up, I'll try to recognize you. I would like this to be interactive. If it gets out of hand, I'll do a
So
little...
questions are allowed during the panel session.
Questions are allowed during the panel session. Bickering is allowed. Alternate historical viewpoints are
How
allowed.
about kibitzing? What you mentioned.
No, not kids. And I'm happy to let that run free unless it starts to get out of hand, and then I'll push back a little. So, Dan?
Before you go,
Sure.
you made a statement which seemed somewhat out there. Is why do you choose 100 base T as which somehow Ethernet won? I would have thought that it would have put one earlier than that.
Why don't we wait until we get to that point in the progression? But I think that's perfectly,
I think Dan has
that's a perfectly
a
reasonable.
possible answer, because when 10 base T came out, I think Token Ring was still viable.
So, I would like to sort of go through this
Okay.
sequentially, so you can bicker about that one towards the end.